Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. Staying with geopolitics and global markets, the rupture to the post-1945 international order isn't just about reshaping power dynamics. It's fundamentally rewriting the rules for business and capital flows across Africa. With Trump's withdrawal from 66 international organizations, a captured Venezuelan president, and intensifying US-China competition, African economies face a stark choice. Navigate this chaos independently or unite to extract better terms. Joining me now is Amaka Anku, Africa head at Eurasia Group, which just released its top risks for 2026. Amaka argues that Nigeria and South Africa, Africa's two largest economies, should abandon decades of rivalry and form a strategic partnership to lead the continent through this turbulent era. The question is, can they do it? And what happens to African businesses if they don't? Welcome to the show, Amaka, after such a while.
Thanks
Great
for
to
having
see
me.
you. I feel like you should be having this conversation with Cyril Ramaphosa and President Bola Tinubu and you in between the two of them. But, Eurasia's group has a top risk for 2026, and its top risk is U.S. political revolution. It talks about dismantling checks on U.S. power,
Yes.
And then the pullback of the international organizations and all of that, Maduro in Venezuela, and so on and so forth. There's a whole laundry list. Yeah. So for African CEOs and finance ministers watching all of this unfold, what does the, if I may use the term, collapse of this world order mean for economies and businesses?
Yeah, so I think it depends there. I think a lot of African firms are looking at this and saying, oh, this doesn't really impact us. I think it does, right? The impact might not be immediate, right? So, for example, there are changes happening that could be happening to supply chains that could impact African firms, right? So if you're thinking about a world in which...
Can you give us examples, because I've heard that a lot,
Yeah. So let me just take a step back and frame this a little bit. So a top risk is there is a political revolution in the US, where Trump is systematically dismantling checks on his power. The goal is to capture the machinery of government and weaponize it for himself and against his allies. That has implications for the world, because the more checks he dismantles on himself domestically, that means that less checks on his power externally, right? Yes. And the whole point of the international rules-based order was that hegemons acted like there were some constraints on their power, right? Mm-hmm. And now we're getting rid of that pretense. What does that mean? So, for example, when you have sanctions on a country, right? Historically, you needed to sort of get in a lot of buy-in from the international community.
But now you go bilaterally and you act bilaterally.
So the idea is, if we're in a world where sanctions on a country or on a firm could be because of Trump's whims, right? I think African firms need to be thinking about what does that mean for how they're structuring their supply chains, for payment systems. There are risks of, for example, getting locked out of financial systems. It's not a 5-year risk. It could be a 10-year risk or 2 decades risk, right? But what are we doing? What are they doing today to think about how to be more resilient for those kinds of things?
I think that makes a lot of sense. If we bring it down, part of what you wrote in the article, I think it was in the Foreign Affairs article, is that Nigeria and South Africa should form a strategic partnership. Now, this is interesting because historically they've sort of been rivals. Yes. So I want to understand the economic case for this alliance. And part of the reason I say that, I remember a time when you had Obasanjo, Thabo Mbeki, during the Ivorian conflict, and he had the NEPAD, New Economic Partnership for Africa's Development, right? There was a strong leadership voice. Yes. What is this new case for an economic alliance between South Africa and Nigeria?
So I want to say they haven't always been rivals, because like you said, Obasanjo and Mbeki worked together to transform the OAU to the AU, right? And that was a point of leadership for Africa. I think the case for a partnership today is that these are the two largest economies, or the two powerful economies on the continent, right? And if you are an investor and you are looking at, say, for example, if Nigeria and South Africa agree that if you get regulatory approvals in, say, South Africa, you automatically get qualified for Nigeria.
That's an interesting one. Not even on a sub-regional
just an
basis.
Example. Yeah, because at this point, I mean, we can talk about AFCFTA and what it means for it. But imagine as an investor that you're automatically doubling your potential market. And it just makes it a lot more attractive than only Nigeria.
I love the way you dream, because I'm just thinking, like, let's get it right in SADC and ECOWAS first. But I think that's interesting.
The reason I'm saying that is, look, there are a lot of negotiating costs to rally in 54, 55 countries, even 15 if you're thinking about the regions, right? But if you just have two people in the room who are determined, and that's how Europe worked, right? It was France and Germany that underpinned it, with the US as the big brother in the background, right? But you kind of have to have a couple of the biggest voices come together and say we're doing this, and then pull it Egypt and others
and that's an interesting idea. So that kind of partnership that sort of sees South Africa and Nigeria as one market, what sector is it more likely to be successful? Is there a sector that could actually really be a good trial model for that kind of partnership?
So I think if you look at Nigeria's exports to South Africa and South Africa's exports to Nigeria, they're very different now, right? Nigeria is mostly exporting crude. South Africa has a more diverse exports to Nigeria, including vehicles. There are ways for them to partner in a way that would not directly clash. So Nigeria's banking sector, for example, I think would very much benefit from expanding into South Africa. Zenith right now is opening branches across West Africa and even in the Middle East, right? Of course, South Africa has one of the deepest capital markets, if not the deepest capital markets on the continent, right? So you can see a situation where Nigeria's banking sector can benefit from expanding, and maybe they can figure out how to standardize some regulations that can make that easier. And for South Africa, the auto vehicles could penetrate deeper in Nigeria, because that's not a place where Nigeria is strong. And right now, the US is imposing significant tariffs on South Africa's vehicles because that has been one of their top markets. So it's an opportunity for them to pivot.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I want to talk about the US because one of the things that this new Trump world has shown, he's very transactional.
Yes.
So he's extracted pledges from countries like Japan, Korea, countries in the Gulf. He's kind of forced people to the negotiating table. If you look at Africa's countries' contribution to global GDP, it's just 5% of global GDP, but 20% of the global population.
Yeah.
So we're really kind of, are we risking becoming just passive agents in someone else's game, where we essentially just become price takers, as they say? What should that strategy be? What should our leverage be in this kind of transaction-driven environment? So
we are price takers, right? So I wouldn't sugarcoat that. But there are disadvantages and advantages to that. The advantage is that Africa trades very little with the US. So if you look at Africa's exports to the US, it's about 6% of exports. If you look at the major markets, South Africa is like 8, Nigeria is 10. And so that actually limits Trump's leverage for the continent, right? Because the more dependent you are on the US for your exports, the more leverage he has, because the more he can hurt you through tariffs.
And especially now that AGOA has pretty much fallen away.
AGOA is pretty much irrelevant now, because it doesn't really matter what you do with AGOA as long as it's 15%, 10% minimum tariffs right now for most people. So I think there is a bit of leverage given the limited trade-in, but that's why I say you have to have, in my view, South Africa and Nigeria. It's not just limited to them, but they need to come together and start rallying people to say, okay, what are we doing about AFCFTA? If I were advising them, I would say you should make a big show of AFCFTA implementation. It's going to be hard to get 55 countries to do that, but like South Africa and Nigeria should come together and have this. These are the South African firms that are exporting through AFCFTA right now. Nigeria should come and say, these are the Nigerian firms, right? Because right now it's a black hole. Nobody knows what's happening with AFCFTA. Is it working? Is it not, right? We need these two countries to lead and champion it. And then the private sector will take it more seriously.
Okay, very interesting. You know, one of Eurasia risks, if we can just get the top risks on screen again, one of Eurasia's risks is state capitalism with American characteristics. So the US government, and it's a very interesting way you guys termed it, the US government taking equity stakes in companies, revenue sharing deals, political interference in markets. How should African sovereigns and pension funds as well think about US investment exposure now? Is America still the safe haven?
Yes.
Oh,
I have to say
yes.
Okay. Yes. Actually, one of our red herrings is sell America.
Yes. Sell America.
Yeah, we're saying red herring.
Okay.
We're saying it's not as big a trend as people think it is.
Right.
Why? Because the US is still the deepest and most liquid capital market in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's going to take a long time to change, right? What we are seeing, though, is that there are more US investors and others making a small allocation to foreign assets, right? So there is a shift, but we're talking about US Treasuries markets is 32 trillion. It's a huge market, right? For Africa, even a tiny shift away from that can make a huge difference. So we are seeing, like, I don't want to overstate it, we are seeing more allocation of funds going to international funds and away from US, for example, equity funds, right? We're seeing, if you look at what happened in 2025 versus 2024, small allocations to US equity funds, higher to international funds, right? It's still a small shift, but it can be very significant for the continent. But at the end of the day, yes, this is going to take a long time. Ian was at Davos and he said most of the CEOs were talking about diversifying away from the US.
Yes.
How they're going to do it and at what pace they're going to do it remains to be seen.
And it's interesting because, of course, I was there and listening to Trump's speech. He started his speech talking about the American growth story. Of course, some of that had to be fact-checked, but it brought back this idea of the exceptionalism of the US economy, that somehow it's more competitive and stronger. We're seeing the dollar strengthen in recent days. But let's move away from the US for a second, because if you have troubles with one partner, you naturally go and look for someone else to do business with. The China story is interesting because it's not necessarily now the clear alternative for African countries and government. We saw, I don't know if you saw at the top of my show, moving from net lender to net collector has its own domestic headwinds. You know, how does China fit into this story, particularly in light of South Africa and Nigeria as the continent's two biggest economies? Yeah,
look, China is most African countries' largest trading partner, right? That's significant. And if you look at, I think what's important here is that we now need to push China, Africans now need to push China to support, you know, the new export markets opportunities for Africa. So what do I mean by that? China has recently removed tariffs on everything, on I think it's a large percentage of goods from a lot of countries from Africa, right? They're trying to position as they're closing their markets, we're opening our markets, right? The challenge, of course, for Africa has always been the ability to take advantage for value-added goods, because most of exports to China is still raw commodities, right? And so there needs to be both on the part of African governments, a more concerted effort at making sure that we're working on those standardization, certification requirements to be able to export more value-added stuff, but also pushing China to support that, to actually put some meat behind. If you really want to support this, improving exports to your country, put some money behind that as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting about the value-added goods, because Dr. Okoje-Iweala, during a conversation I had with her at Davos, she did say that was one of the main barriers to intra-African trade. The idea, or just generally our trade figures, we're still mostly focused on non-value-adding goods, right? Raw commodities. But let's bring it down practically now, because I'm fascinated by your South Africa-Nigeria partnership. Now, if you're running a Nigerian bank today, expanding across the continent, or South African mining company, or let's say Kenyan tech startup, which of these geopolitical risks do you risk underpricing? It's really important, but you can easily just look over the gloss of it.
So I would actually argue that we're probably not underpricing. Well, what we're probably underpricing is the opportunity.
Okay.
Right? Because I think everybody understands, the world is changing. Like I said, a lot of the risks are more long-term, right? It's more of a long-term risk potential to disruption of supply chains and potentially getting locked out of financial systems. That's really, really long-term, and you should be thinking about it. I think the nearer-term risk is what I talked about in terms of shifting asset allocations, right? And also a mindset. Part of the reason, where I always say that investment is underpinned by hope. Right. And hope is underpinned by how we feel about ourselves.
Okay, that's
it's
interesting.
True. And how we feel about ourselves in Africa is relative to what's happening elsewhere in the world. Right? So for a long time, a lot of African investors, or should I just say African consumers, feel, we're such a mess because everywhere else is structured. But if everywhere else is a mess, right, maybe it changes the perception, our own self-perception. And I think the opportunities that we're not thinking enough about is how do we take advantage of people thinking, maybe it's not so bad in Africa after all, because the US is starting to look more like some of the risks in Africa, right? So maybe those hygiene factors in Nigeria, maybe I could deal with them, and I'm more willing to allocate assets there.
That's interesting. So now you're in a room now. You're sitting with President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, you're sitting with Cyril Ramaphosa, and you've talked about how the continent's two leading economies should move forward. What would be the three things you would advise them to do now to strengthen that economic partnership?
I would say number one, start coordinating basic diplomatic, should I say, stances.
Okay.
Right? Together.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to Trump. So when Trump is accusing South Africa of white genocide,
Nigeria should step in and defend.
Nigeria should issue a statement and say something. I support that. Yes, do that. And same with South Africa with Nigeria. When you bomb Nigeria, say something.
Right.
Number two, make a big show of AFCFTA implementation. Number three, pool capital to invest in strategic sectors. Like together.
All right. Interesting. Very, very fascinating conversation. Amaka, Anku. The report, the Eurasia Group Top Risks, is on the Eurasia Group website. I encourage anybody interested in geopolitics, the economy, the global economy, to certainly read that. But great to have you on the show as always. Hopefully we'll have you back in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all we have time for on Business Week this week. I'm Rolake Akinkubefeleni. Let's continue the conversation on X. As always, do have a lovely rest of the weekend.